Okay, so my name is David Steffen. I know most of you, and I have been trained as a historian, but have a lot of different interests in science, earth science, forestry, just a lot of different things. And archaeology has always been very fascinating to me. Archaeology is the science of going through other people's garbage. Old garbage. But actually, all kidding aside, it is a subset of anthropology, and anthropology is, simply put, the study of man. So the study of man, study of man's cultures. Archaeology is looking at the past and how man developed their cultures, how they lived in the past, and this survey, and that's what it is, it's kind of a survey of a lot of the different methodologies and techniques from other scientific disciplines, how they relate to archaeology, and how this is a really exciting time in archaeology, in my opinion, because there's so many different ways you can go, so many different technologies and other fields that you can apply that we're not always strictly the base set of skills in archaeology. So that's why we're here today, is to talk about those interdisciplinary approaches using those other scientific disciplines to learn more through archaeology and our learning about the past and people's lives in the past. So again, the multidisciplinary approach, I love it because it fits into so many of the other things I do, both in my private life and then also as a forester and as a mitigation specialist, studying wildfires, their effect on people, people's effect on the forest, and all of that sort of thing. So we'll talk about that. But I'll go back to my very first dig. So that was at 8 years old, and we got the National Geographic, like most families did, and living way up Middle Creek, about 9 miles west of La Vida, off-grid, very back-to-the-land type of family, and my mom was always looking for something for us to do, and no TV or anything like that, and so she's like, well, why don't you guys go conduct an archaeological dig? And we're like, oh, okay. And I was mentioning earlier that it was very fortunate where we had built our house was it looked like a natural flat area. Turned out there had previously been a corral there, and the corral was for the family that lived at the Middle Creek Toll House. So that road had been developed to go over to Fort Garland, originally to Fort Massachusetts, but Fort Garland, and of course the military traffic got to go through free, but any civilian traffic, they had to stop and pay the toll at this little house, and it was just a very natural bottleneck where you went up kind of a hill and onto a rise. The creek was here, and then there was a very, very steep hillside here, so nobody could duck their toll. My sister, who was 5 at the time, and I went out and we gridded off an area where the toll house was, and we did a dig square, and it turned out that our dig square was right at the back door where the people swept out everything that hit the floor that they didn't want to pick up, which included small change, broken pottery, other assorted garbage, marbles, probably that the kids had lost, and so a very exciting introduction to the classical kind of Americanist archaeology that we'll talk about. So another very useful project that I've taken part in and was able to do post-fire, so I've given talks on the burn scar and sort of my role in helping do a lot of the remediation and the restoration after the burn of the burn scar in 2018. So we were working on hydrological projects, trying to keep the water that was coming off the burn scar from coming down massively and destructively, taking topsoil and trying to keep as much of the topsoil as we could up there. And we found a gulch that had been, the channel had been completely incised, and we just had a cut bank, which for an archaeologist that's very exciting because you get to see the cross section. And we saw 4 distinct burn lines in that cross section, and obviously all those fires have been very minor compared to this fire, because this fire actually blew everything away down to bedrock. But that gave us a very good look into historical burns, and I actually have that table, so we could discuss that. If anybody's particularly interested in that, I could talk about that. And I will also refer to some of these things during my talk, because I'm also going to try to talk about some of the advantages and limitations of these different topics and these different techniques that we're going to discuss. But the idle-while burn levels, we used a combination of carbon-14 dating, which again I'll talk about the advantages and limitations, and OSL, optically stimulated luminescence, to determine when these big fires happen. And then I was doing this in conjunction with two hydrologists that work for the Colorado Geologic Survey, and they actually took it a step further, and they correlated historic, or as much as we can determine, very bad drought years to try to correlate bad drought years and then the resulting mega fires that we had. They go back to the early first millennium AD, these 4 big fires. So that was a very interesting project. I call it my gig. It's called Timna. It's in southern Israel. It's also called the CTV project, meaning the Central Timna Valley Project. It's been going since, I believe, 2013. It's put on by the University of Tel Aviv, and it is in the area they call the Arava. And the Arava is the valley that the Dead Sea is, I believe, like 800 feet below sea level. And then the Red Sea, which attaches down to the Indian Ocean on out, has, on a map, it looks like 2 little bunny ears at the top, and the Sinai Peninsula is in the middle. And the Arava starts at the top of the east little bunny ear of the Red Sea, and it has the mountains of Sinai to the west, and then it's got the Edomite Mountains in Jordan to the east. And so this big broad valley that goes, and then it starts dropping down into the Dead Sea. But one of the very interesting things about that area was that it has very prolific copper deposits in the sandstone that is there. And they believe that that man first started mining that actually as pigment. So it's this beautiful green colored ore that's in the rock, and they thought, well, that's pretty. But somehow along the line, and you know, this is in my imagination, somebody had a campfire. They took some of these rocks that had this green in it. The wind stoked up this campfire. Suddenly, this beautiful, beautiful reddish-colored metal formed that was copper. And so that's how I like to imagine it. But it's very possible that this location was actually the genesis of man's working in metallurgy. That's where they first started to develop metal. And so, and this, I think it's probably the earliest, I want to say 7,000 years ago, was when we believe that they first started making copper. And then, of course, different people came to do it. Different tribes developed different technologies. The Egyptians were there, but the Edomites, which were actually a nomadic kingdom, and it actually, they don't get a lot of credit. I'll talk a little bit about biases in some of the just overall field. Some of the biases, they have what they call an architectural bias against them, because a lot of people think, well, you've got to have big buildings and monuments to be a great empire. But the Edomites were a nomadic empire, and you think about the Mongols that lived in yurts out on the steppe. They were a great empire, but they were not a sedentary. They were nomadic people that had still a lot of power and were still able to move around. But the Edomites became very prominent because they developed this technology to make copper, and that was like a license to print money, because in some cases copper was money in those times. So a lot of these examples that I will give will be framed within my experiences at the Central Timna Valley Project, and sort of some of the things that we've used to make our lives easier and to answer a lot of the questions. So, get a drink real quick here. So, archaeology as such, as it is now, has not existed for more than probably, I would say, 200 years. But there's a lot of talk about ancient practitioners of archaeology, and some of you may have heard about some of the Egyptian pharaohs that were undertaking archaeology because they had such a vastly long civilization, and they wanted to learn about who'd come before, about knowing about those things in their culture, knowing about their religion. You know, the priesthood held a lot of power, and then of course a lot of their religion was based on the mummification, the preservation of bodies, the whole Book of the Dead about how to prepare the nobility for the afterlife, and a lot of these incantations, processes, I guess you would say, that the spirit would have to do to navigate the afterlife was based on this. So it was very interesting to them to see how this had been done before. It was obviously a long-standing civilization. And so a lot of times we hear Thutmose IV being credited as the first archaeologist because the story goes that he fell asleep within the front of the paws of the Sphinx. And he had a dream, and the Sphinx told him that if you unbury me and you erect a stela here, which is pretty much like an informational sign of hieroglyphics, telling about how you found me again, and I'll make you pharaoh. So a lot of times he's given that title of the first archaeologist, and that he was his reigning period was 1401 to 1391 BC. So another Egyptian that was actually took it a lot further was one of Ramses' great sons, and his name was Prince Kamwaset, and he lived from 1279 to 1213 BC, and he was one that really took it a lot further. He wanted to understand what a lot of the inscriptions meant, work on tracing back their dynasties, who'd been in power, just where a lot of the beliefs came from. And so, yeah, he did take it quite a bit further as far as that goes. And his interest really was religious. He was one of the head priests, and a lot of their power derived by knowing how to apply their religion. Nabonidus was the last emperor of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and he excavated a lot of their older buildings, found a lot of the history of who had been before him in his dynasty and the other Babylonian dynasties. But I mentioned he was the last emperor, and the Persians came and took them over, and so but he was the last one. But we know a lot about the Babylonians because of his work, because he undertook this project to discover a lot of their history, a lot of who'd done what, the wars. They recorded the wars, victories, losses. They tend to really minimize the losses, so you have to take that sort of with a grain of salt. But those were the real early ancient practitioners of archaeology. During the Renaissance, we saw a great interest in the neoclassical civilizations, the Greeks especially, also the Romans, and the people during that time were known as antiquarians. So they were really interested in looking at antiquities, and so they were interested in learning about what the neoclassical life was like. That was when there was a lot of rediscovery of like Greek sculpture and that sort of thing, and so that was really kind of a development. And they didn't have really a unified science at that time, but it was definitely a very interesting development. But out of the Renaissance came Renaissance men, and Renaissance men had a great wide desire to understand a lot of different disciplines, art, science, history, and Thomas Jefferson, of course, being one of the last Renaissance men, but of course having a very profound effect on the United States, and a lot of his writings that during his life he wrote over 18,000 letters to learned men all over Europe, and he became interested in discovering the history of the mound builders, the mound builder Indians that had a very large impact on the eastern United States. And again, that was something that was very, very visible. And Bob talked about that, his experiences with those. But Thomas Jefferson decided to do a dig on Monticello, where he had a mound, and he used a technique that was really developed because of geology, stratigraphy, in geology, initially the idea is that the newer things are on top and the older things on the bottom. Obviously, it's a lot more complex than that, but that just really set the stage for relative dating. So relative dating it could be construed to be a little bit off, but you're not dating relatives, you're dating events, and you're dating the events as to what happened in relationship with other events. So that is versus absolute dating or chronometric dating, which is getting down to dates. Exact dates, but you're figuring out when things happened in relation to each other. So from Thomas Jefferson and his foray into archaeology, and that formed the Americanist school. So a lot of the kind of thoughts and procedures that we do now is really based on the Americanist school. This is my archaeology textbook from college at Western State, and by David Hurst Thomas, and it details a lot of kind of the development of the classic Americanist archaeology that was developed in the 1800s through the 1900s. And it's very interesting as far as a lot of the people that were developed. There's a lot of biography in that book too. So I brought some books that I recommend, and that is one of them. So starting into some of the fields that we will talk about, and ones that kind of affected me and still affect me. First of all, archaeobotany. So we're looking at plants, and we're looking at plants and how they related to what people were doing, how people lived, agriculture, technology, farming, and a lot of things like that. So my experience with dendrochronology, it really started with when I was, I think, in 7th grade or something, going to Mesa Verde and learning that they had been able to establish chronology based on tree rings in the timbers in the houses there, and then with dendrochronology you're able to correlate as you find things, and of course in the Southwest being dry, things that are very well preserved with sap, you are able to correlate tree rings, and of course tree rings are a record of the climate. So in a good year, and this is a piece of, we call this a cookie in the forestry business. It's from Kachara Pass, and it's a bristlecone, and it's between 165 and 180 years old. I haven't taken the time to really count everything, but as a tree lives, on good years it adds more, and on poor years it adds less. One of the things that is a shortcoming about this, as you can see with this cookie, is that towards the end of a tree's life, it's growing less and less. And so that's a limitation. But you're always looking for those proportions of tree ring growth to see what things look like. Something that foresters use is an increment bore, and this allows you to bore into the tree without really harming it. You extract a record of the tree roots. And so this also is from a bristlecone, but this was a live bristlecone that was about 80 years old up on Kachara Pass. And so with this, you go in, twist it into the tree, and then when you get into the middle of the tree, as close as you can determine, you pull this out, and the extractor, this pulls out that nice little dowel of wood that gives you a record of the tree's relative growth during different years, and how it did. So the tricky part is finding older, deader trees, or trees that have been preserved in architecture and that sort of thing. And so we have a very good record, probably about 12,000 years back, through dendrochronology in the Southwest. And a lot of it's because of ponderosa pine and bristlecone, and there's bristlecone that I believe are living ones that are 7,000 years old. So that gives us a lot of span of time. But again, the limitations is that you have to have them from the same kind of microclimate area. You get too far away, we see this in Colorado, like the north can be completely wet one year, we're down here in the drought. So it's kind of limiting geographically that you have to have them fairly close. But over the years, and through very careful, a lot of attention to detail, you can set these up next to each other and say, okay, here we are, and you can just go go back and really determine how old things are. So that's one that I really like to use. It's really applicable to me, also as a forester. It's very applicable, again, in determining forest fires and kind of what we call the natural fire return regimen, which if people weren't interfering with the forest, what the natural average of years go by before a fire comes through. And of course, we've been suppressing fire for so long that when a fire comes, it's absolutely destructive, kills everything, sterilizes the soil, puts a sheen on the soil called hydrophobic soil, and then it causes extreme flooding downstream. And so that's really where my interest in that is. And of course, like I mentioned, that was really the first thing that I discovered as far as a very interesting dating method goes. So carbon-14, we hear a lot about that. So carbon-14 being an isotope that is trapped within organic materials, and most generally it's going to be trees. The biggest limitation with that is what they call the old wood problem, and that is the tree could have been 400 years old. Like for example, on this wildfire up here where I'm looking at a charcoal layer, that tree could have already been 4 years old when it got burned. It could have been 3 years old. So there's a lot of unwanted flexibility in carbon-14. But another interesting thing about carbon-14 is that trees at certain times of high solar flare activity, electromagnetics from the sun, I think it was called the Miyake events. They were times when the sun was very, very active, and the carbon-14 was really collected in the trees. And that one was one that they were able to really dial in when the Viking settlement at Lansall Meadows in eastern Newfoundland, when that happened, because there had been a Miyake event, I believe in the 1700s, where all the solar radiation from the sun was causing the trees to put up additional carbon-14 into their tissues. And so again, but you have to do a lot of research to really locate things that you know, but then you can use supposition, extrapolation to apply artifacts from another area if you have these markers. And so the carbon-14 is commonly used for that. Archaeozoology, we talked about that. Actually, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So in archaeobotany, also a very large kind of segment of archaeobotany is looking at pollens, and pollens are trapped in lake sediments and then even dunes, various places that, again, it goes back to that stratigraphy. We're thinking about the things that are older, typically going to be lower. There are a few very interesting exceptions to that. That's called superposition. So that means that the older might be on top of the newer because of various external forces. Even somebody, an animal digging something up and taking the older from the bottom and putting it on top. But the archaeobotany, the pollens especially are very, very interesting because looking at pollens under a microscope, it's amazing to me what distinct characteristics different kinds of pollens have. It's just amazing. You could just not imagine the variation of pollens. And so that it allows scientists today, to really see what plants were being cultivated, what plants were naturally occurring at a site, and sort of the man's relationship to them and that sort of thing too. So archaeozoology, typically we talk about faunal remains, so that's just remains of animals. That doesn't necessarily strictly mean skeletal remains. It could also be hair, it could be hides, it could be treated leather that was actually utilized by man as clothing or for tools, belts, things of that nature. And so what what I've adopted is my niche in archaeology is archaeoecology. So you combine the elements of archaeobotany and zoology, and you kind of see how man, whether they are utilizing natural plants and animals, whether they're importing plants and animals, if there's invasive plants and animals, just you can establish kind of what the ecology of a site was. And that really, really fascinates me. So that's something that I'm highly, highly interested in. I think that just really gives us a lot of understanding into the life ways of the people that we're trying to understand. Moving on to the next topic, that's remote sensing. And the very first example that really kind of changed things immensely was when man learned how to fly. And when you learn how to fly, you can see things that you completely miss from the ground. And several examples of this, the Nazca lines in South America, these huge geoglyphs that were so massive that you couldn't even see them from the ground, or if you saw them, you would not recognize that they were a symbolic, illustration. So planes came, once we had planes and we were able to look down on things. And one of my very interesting experiences in southern Israel, I will tell you about, and I actually have pre-illustrated on the back. When we were there, a lot of people that are, a lot of the graduate students will do presentations, and some of them are just at evening after the dig, they do a presentation and they do a slideshow about whatever they're working on. But there was a gentleman there that was from one of the kibbutzes in the Araba Valley, and he had become very interested in what was there. And it's very nice working in the desert because there's very minimal artifacts, which it makes everything more meaningful in my mind. You don't have, wheelbarrow buckets of sherds that you're having to deal with. Everything, whether it's charcoal, whether it's ore from copper, all of these things are just, in my mind, just a little, are much more meaningful, and you just get a lot more interpretation from them. So this gentleman, I think his name was Asaf, he was going to take us on a field trip to go see desert kites. And I'm like, what is this? Is this, the Bedouin herders, when they get bored and the sheep are being lazy, they take out a kite and start flying? I'm like, because I had no idea what we were getting into when we went out into the desert on this field trip. So what desert kites are actually, they are actually lines of rocks, and the scale of this would probably be several thousand feet in this square. So the desert kites were actually used just like the native tribes here in North America herded buffalo over buffalo jumps, so that they could utilize, very, very effectively and efficiently, get a lot of their food quickly. The early settlers in this part of Israel used these desert kites, which these would be long rows of rock, and their game that they were hunting was gazelles. There's actually still gazelles in this area today, but you would think, well, walking along these walls, they're maybe 20 inches tall, and it's like a gazelle, you would think could just fly right over that if it wanted to, but it's actually kind of a psychological trap. So if you've ever seen somebody moving a whole herd of sheep and like across a highway, and they see like a stripe painted on the highway, and the sheep have their eyes on their side of their heads, so their depth perception is not like ours. Our eyes are in the front of our heads, and so we have a lot better depth perception, but sheep have their eyes on their sides of their heads so they can watch for predators, and they see that line and they think it's something three-dimensional, not just a line painted on the highway. So you'll see sheep jumping over a painted line. And so what happens with these gazelles was it would just be a small little row of rocks, but they won't jump it. They just won't jump it. And so they would run down this line, and these lines just slowly converge. And typically you would have a wadi, like a arroyo. You'd have a slight drop off, and then inside here, this is the kill box where they would actually be there with spears or bows and arrows. And when the gazelles would just start concentrating into this converging point here, and then they would get into there, then they would kill them en masse. And so these were not known until the British started flying airplanes from Cairo to Damascus in the early, probably the 1920s is when they started doing this. These pilots are flying above this section of desert and seeing these massive structures, and they just started calling them desert kites. It's like, hey, did you see that desert kite out there? And so that was that really, kind of illustrates. Once we could see things from above, we started seeing things that we had not, had been there for centuries, and we just didn't even know they were there. So that covers the plane. Of course, drones. Drones have been around for a while, but they have not been so readily accessible, cheap to fly as they have in just the last couple of decades. And so I got put on the team that was doing the archaeological survey of a great huge area, like 6 square kilometers, that had not been checked very thoroughly before, and we'll talk about some of the factors that tell archaeologists where to dig. It was just these areas just had never been really checked before, and we started out with kind of a large team of 6 to 8 people, and a lot of times with archaeological survey, it's kind of like hands across America, and everybody's just going along, and you stay very close together, and you're just looking for stuff, and you find something's interesting, you make a note of it, coordinates are taken down, and then later somebody can come back and investigate. But the drone just was a tremendous game changer as far as, two of us out there with this drone were doing the work of hundreds of people previous, what would have been previous for the survey. And so we were looking for stone shelters in that part of the country. A lot of it had been semi-permanent tents, and so the tents would be protected by rings of rock. And so those were things that we were looking at. And once we were able to locate those with the drone, then we'd say, oh, well, that doesn't look like much. Or like, oh, there's definitely something here. And then we'd go in and do just kind of a brief survey of what could be seen from the surface at this point. Because, again, we weren't doing test pits at this time because we just had so much ground to cover. But, it was looking for things that were interesting. And back there's so many different eras, we're like, well, this could be British from, the 1920s, this could be, Ottoman from the 1700s, it could be, Edomite from, 1000 BC, Egyptian from 1200 BC, so just really interesting to be able to cover a lot of area. Of course, satellite, and that was another one. We looked at satellite images. The professor that is the director of the dig had looked at satellite images and found a very large, very interesting rectangular structure on top of a mountain that had never been examined. And so we got to climb up there, and it was a tumulus. It was a rock structure that it had probably been a Bedouin burial site. But something that we found out, and I'll talk about it a little bit under optically stimulated luminescence, that a lot of the very archaic herdsmen of the area, they'd actually built leopard traps. And they were trapping the leopards so the leopards wouldn't eat their sheep or them, and they weren't really interested in utilizing the carcass of the leopard, but they were just interested in not having them be the predator. And so in the desert, to bring an assemblage of rocks together, that takes a lot of energy, and a lot of these have been repeatedly reused over the centuries. And so a lot of these leopard traps had been reused by the Bedouin as burial mounds. They've been reused by the Ottomans as fortifications, just all sorts of things over the centuries that somebody had already done the work of bringing these stones together, so why not reutilize it? And then, of course, LiDAR, which was very significant in the book we read, and LiDAR using a number of little laser pulses, many laser pulses per second to form a 3D representation of the surface. And I actually used LiDAR after the fire happened to kind of identify the fluvial hazards of places where a flood would come and damage and build up debris and that sort of thing if there was bad floods coming off of the burn scar. So I've seen LiDAR, it is absolutely amazing. I found things on our ranch on Middle Creek, old logging roads and things like that, old dugouts, that had no clue were even there. And LiDAR just brought them out just clear as day. So that is, those are all kind of go under the remote sensing and how we use that and how that has just developed just over the last century and even over the last decade has really taken off. Some of the other high-tech dating techniques, ground penetrating radar. So that is something that saves you a lot of work. It's a non-invasive technique, so you're penetrating the ground and it shows up objects that are under the ground, so you're not disturbing them, you're not spending a whole bunch of labor to dig a pit that you might not find anything. So that is one that's been really extensively used. OSL, the optically stimulated luminescence, that was one that they were using on these leopard traps at the Timna dig. But it's also something that I mentioned on this Idlewild burn levels, we were using OSL too. And so OSL in simplest terms means that when a rock is, especially quartz crystals, they are exposed to sunlight, it kind of resets them, and when they get buried, there's a kind of a rate of decay as long as it stays buried. And so what optically stimulated luminescence is reading pretty much when that rock last saw the sun. And so the limitation of it is that it could have been an artifact that was on the surface for a long time and then became buried. But in our case, it worked pretty well because the fire lines, the burn levels, we knew that within a couple of seasons they had been buried. So that was something that we could get in pretty close with that. Obsidian hydration, so obsidian is a volcanic rock that really is volcanic glass, and some of the very best arrowheads and that sort of thing were made of obsidian, extremely sharp, but also like glass, extremely brittle. But obsidian hydration uses the flaked edge and the amount of water that has been absorbed, the rate again of how that newly exposed edge relates to the amount of water that's in it. So just kind of mind-blowing techniques, in my opinion. Archaeomagnetism, and again, this is another one of those that's really kind of mind-blowing. Archaeomagnetism uses the position of the magnetic poles as it relates to objects with magnetic materials in it. It doesn't necessarily have to be metal. It can be magnetite, it can be naturally occurring magnetic elements. And archaeomagnetism works with whenever something, with pottery, the one that was the guy that's kind of the number 2 guy on the Timna project, they were doing it was a excavation for a parking lot right off the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and they found this very nice villa, good-sized villa, but they figured out through the layers, the destruction layers, that was from the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem. I believe it was 386 BC, but because of contemporary records kept by the Babylonians, and they were able to figure out literally the very day that this happened. And it was like August 4th, 386 BC, or something like that. I'm not positive on the date, but just for example's sake. But the problem is that, again, the poles switch, and you need to have correlated factors. So you need to have historical observations. You have to have other examples, such as the Denver chronology. But once you've established this kind of system of an example of knowns, then you can kind of fill in the unknowns with this archaeomagnetism. So that again was something that very cool, very mind-blowing, and just gives us a lot of insight into when things occurred, when artifacts can be dated from. Other fields and techniques, DNA, of course, we've been using that a lot. That really applies to kind of ethnographical questions of who were these people, who were they related to, where did they come from, and we can use this to track modern descendants or modern relatives. That also brings us into linguistics. So linguistics, if we have overall language families that we know about, we can track the migrations of people and find out where they ended up using linguistics. Geography and GIS, so this is taking geographical information and putting it into a system. It can be like literally a map. It could be a point cloud of different points of interest, and you analyze how this affects all sorts of things. So another interesting one is reverse engineering. So as we start to learn about the technology of ancient peoples, and we can actually start to figure out what they're doing. And one of the things that Tel Aviv University has been doing is that they have been working on trying to figure out how the people did their furnaces for making copper. And they've actually made some, and initially they were using blow tubes, and then of course they progressed to using bellows, and they also in some places used natural winds to stoke the fires. But that's a really interesting one. That makes it, in my mind, really, really personal. If you're trying to replicate their technology, that gives you a great deal of insight into what they went through and what they figured out. But in those days, the ability to make copper and then, of course, alloying it with tin, which came from either Turkey or Afghanistan, you made bronze. And I mentioned earlier about how this was literally a license to make money, that a lot of times the bottom of the furnace, there would be basically shaped like a bowl. It would be an ingot of copper, and that would be a trade. It's like a block of silver today, bullion. But another thing that they also would make axes. And so it was something that was very practical, or if you wanted to melt it down into something else, you could do that also. So something very interesting too about the people that knew how to, this was like alchemy or even religion. If you knew how to make copper, this was just amazing. And one of the big discoveries, and I think it was about 5 years ago, and actually made the cover of Smithsonian at the Tumna Dig, was that they discovered royal purple cloth. And royal purple cloth is extremely costly to make. They use Murex snails, gland from these snails that are a Mediterranean snail, to make this royal purple. And these people that were basically foundry workers in the desert were wearing royal purple because they were so powerful, wealthy, and well thought of. And so that was really amazing that the dig found that. Mathematics, big thing really is statistical analysis. You're taking raw data points. You're using predictive modeling to discover where the most likely places for things to be. Something that I neglected to mention earlier with some of the places archaeologists, kind of the low-hanging fruit. In the Middle East, they're called tells, and in Hebrew, tel means hill. In Arabic, tal means hill, and it's basically an artificial hill that has been made from layer upon layer of human occupation. So it's a place that is got a very important geographical significance, that it's on the road to the sea, it's on the road to another empire, and they just get built up. Or fresh water, they might have a strategic importance for defense. One good example that comes to mind is Jericho. Jericho is believed to be the longest, one of the oldest cities, and it's been inhabited by numerous civilizations over the years, just because of its strategic location, being on the Jordan River, having good water and that sort of thing. So tells are very apparent because it's just, the cities have been there so long that they're creating an artificial hill. And then, of course, going into there and using that stratigraphy to see who was there, what they were doing, looking for destruction layers, like when somebody came in and burned the whole city down, and then who came back, that sort of thing. So, very interesting application of mathematics to kind of look at it, big picture kind of perspective. Other methods, historical sources, I mentioned those. The Greeks were really good. Josephus, Hebrew historian that worked for the Romans, and of course in my time frame, he recorded a lot of the wars that happened between the Romans and the Jewish state. Folklore, that's one to take with a grain of salt, but they say that a lot of legends have a grain of reality in them, and sometimes it's more than a grain, but sometimes that grain should be salt. So those things, that kind of brings me to the point where I have this question mark of, can anybody think of anything else, and especially in regards to the book, things that could be applicable to our procedural learning about things that we are just completely in the dark about. And I thought the book was really great as far as, we knew so little about their material culture, we knew so little about their linguistics, because linguistics can be huge as far as knowing who their trade partners were, even who their the progenitor civilization that they came out of. And that was what really kind of fascinated me about the city in the book, is that we knew so little about their culture. But that kind of brings me to that, so I'm open to comments about the book, comments, questions about anything that I've covered. Again, this was just kind of a survey, and it was not meant to be exhaustive, but hit kind of the high points and a lot of the things that I have had the practical experience with and have been very impressed with, obviously. So yeah, I'll open it up for questions. Yeah, well.
How does the Latin market fit into all this?
Okay, yeah, that was something that I had mentioned, and some of these methods are actually good to prevent looting. One of them, like the ground penetrating radar, you can see if somebody's been under tunneling things. Yeah, provenance and knowing the context, and that was something that I probably could have talked a little bit more about when I was talking about, like, actually doing dig squares, and preserving the context is extremely important. And so looting has always been a great hindrance to our accurate understanding, because it rips things out of context, it sells them. Sometimes they don't have the opportunity to be studied because they get put in a private collection, and they most likely are not going to be studied, or if they are, it's going to be not shared because it's an illicit trade. So I think that the more we can learn about where things are, and I think that was one of the big debates in the book, was whether they were going to leave things in situ there, and so that they could come back and really understand what the motivation of the people were to leave this assemblage of artifacts there, or if they were going to walk off and let the looters take them. And that was a big kind of ethical poem in the book of what they were going to do. So I don't know, does that answer your question? So, it's a very good point.
Dave, how does LiDAR differ from ground penetrating radar?
So LiDAR is from an aerial platform, so it's
right.
from a plane. LiDAR is a more seismic. So with like seismic, like in petroleum geology, you set off charges, and then that will give you information of what's under the surface. So one is from the air reading the surface, and then one is actually from the surface penetrating the surface. So
it's the GPR that they used in the keys of pyramids.
it could be. I'm not sure. I would. Not to my personal knowledge, but I would not be surprised that would be one. Yeah, that they could determine where passages were without having to knock down walls. So I think and that's one of the great advantages of GPR, is that you're not invasive in your survey. Yes.
You mentioned the Mound people.
Yeah.
In the whole area, all the way from, all the way along Mississippi.
Yeah.
One of the things that I understand about that is one of the difficulties is that many of the people who used it, the tribes, didn't have a written language. They left absolutely nothing. And yet we have some other cultures who have extensive written language. How does that happen?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it can be even come down to superstition, religion, and that sort of thing. Some like the Egyptians, their religion was so much based on the dynasties and record keeping and all these procedures to get to the afterlife. And then other civilizations. I mean, the Hittites were one that, as I understand it, we've barely scraped the surface with the Hittites because they didn't have an easily, the Rosetta Stone helped us immensely with hieroglyphics, that we could see what the Greek was and see what the hieroglyphics were. But yeah, there were cultures that a lot of their traditions were not written down. And I know the Hittites, they had a lot of their religion was in song, and their priests would go to a certain place and sing the gods back at spring to come back, and they'd go sing to tell, to make sure the gods defended them from their enemies, and different things like that. So yeah, I mean, I think that it just really comes down to a lot of what they thought was important, and some groups actually were almost superstitious about writing things down and that sort of thing. In my experience,
It could also be that just because we don't know the language now, we might learn it later. We may miss something.
Yeah, and that was something that was really interesting about the Timna dig that I go to, was that this Ben Rothenberg that excavated in the 50s and 60s, he understood that technology was advancing, that new technologies and new methodologies were coming out, and there was a lot of places that he wasn't greedy, he didn't just go dig everything. And so we go back and he's dug here and said, we dig here and we apply these more modern technologies to it. So so there's, and in this era, it's very nice to have those places that had been set aside for our more advanced methodologies and technologies. Yes, sir.
I'm interested in your thoughts about stone tools and what hominid stone tools, very little stone tools, and what they can tell us about the people who made them, and also your views on portable rock art.
I don't know much about portable rock art. That sounds really cool, but well, the stone tools, I mean, it's one of those things where when some kind of a great development of technology or a paradigm shift happened, like with the Folsom point, that's a beautiful one. When they, or the Adelaide, using a spear thrower, and that allowed just a leap forward in their technology. One of the things you mentioned, stone tools, in the dig that I go to, the copper was initially mined with hammerstones, and so you would actually find shafts that they were using hammerstones. So you see these little peck marks, peck mark, and then I was talking about stratigraphy and some of the ways you cannot always trust stratigraphy of the newer stuff being on the top and the older stuff being on the bottom, because they took that copper and eventually they learned, well, we can make these really nifty chisels out of the copper, and so you have peck mark, and then suddenly you have these beautiful chisel, diagonal chisel marks where they were chiseling down into the shaft. Same shaft, but the old is on the top and the new is on the bottom. But as far as just overall stone tools, and of course that it's always indicative of trade, and some people would share the technology or they trade it for goods. I suppose if you were somebody that knew how to make a really good Folsom point, again, it's kind of like the miners that can make copper. That would be your job. I mean, they were so delicate, but yet very effective for projectile just as points and things like that. So if you mastered that, you could trade those for anything you needed. You could make a Folsom point and then say, oh gosh, now I got to go hunt. Oh well, now I've got to butcher this animal. Oh, now I've got to dry the meat. I've got to tan the hide. I think that once they made that technological leap to a better tool, that was really significant. And then of course, we typify even entire groups of people by their tools and the tools that they developed and then spread in their use.
And one more question.
Okay.
Along with the marbles, etc., that you found out in Middle Creek, if you would have dug deeper, what do you think you might have found?
Well, actually, I can tell you what I have found in that same area, and it was very interesting because the gophers that we have that do their lovely little excavations, they pop all that stuff. I just happened to look down. It was a place I'd walked by 1,000 times, and there was this beautiful red chert arrowhead, and it broken right where the connective notches were on the bottom that the gophers had excavated. So I suppose there could have been something like that underneath. And the hearth that's over here that was found in a drainage project right in the plaza. But again, that's one of the things I was talking about. Where there's water, where there's always been water, and we know from the kind of the alluvial deposits around La Vida that over centuries the Gutierrez River has just wandered its way back and forth across the side of La Vida. So I imagine that wherever the river was, they like to be close to the water, and it was probably cooler, and of course attracted the game and that sort of thing. So I imagine there could be lots of ancient campsites, and I mean, obviously if the Army and the pioneers of the 1860s were using that as a low crossing of the Claver Mountains, that it would have traditionally been a very likely route for commerce and that sort of thing. The other place that I got to work was Pecos Pueblo, and Pecos Pueblo was really unique in its position because it was between kind of the more standard traditional pueblos of the Rio Grande Valley and the Plains Indians, and so it was a great both cultural trading location, but a lot of the technologies and pottery that the pueblos had, yet the nomadic buffalo hunters and everything on the plains, they kind of were able to come together there. And so I got to do a lot of training there with Adobe restoration, and so our final was actually working on the mission church, doing remedial work to the mission church. So I learned to do that so I could keep up with the fort here. So, but yeah, just very interesting interactions, I guess you'd say.
Do you know what the latest is on the part that
And then, do you know?
We're here in 2 weeks. I'll talk about it in a couple weeks.
Oh, right, okay, very good. So, yeah, all right. Yes, ma'am.
I was going to say something in regards to the language and written language. I understand that Genghis Khan and the Mongols, they had no written language. His tribe, his focus was that brutal overtaking of cities, and he had the learned people in those cities write history about him, of course, with a slant towards him.
Right, yeah.
And that's why we know so much about him, is because they didn't write,
Right.
but they had other people write the history.
Yeah, that's a good point, yeah. And I was going to say, the history is the story of the victors, but bad news travels too. So, especially with the threats of those Eastern cultures that were invading Europe and everything, that we have a lot of their records too. So that's a good point. So, Gary.
Have you done any metal detecting in the area?
I have. I think that's another one that has. I started out with a metal detector probably from 1967, and was picking up tin cans and all sorts of things. But the newer metal detectors are really great because they actually have the technology that they have discrimination between different metals and elements and things like that. So that would be a very good thing to do. And I know that again, as a survey tool, metal detecting, obviously if there's a possibility of metal artifacts, that's a really good specific, non-invasive. You don't have to excavate a whole lot. So that's a good point, a good idea.
In nature, we see a lot of things that roll. For example, a log or a boulder. Yet I understand that there were civilizations for thousands of years that did not invent the wheel.
Yeah.
And all these examples in nature, why did it take so long?
That's a really good question, and that comes back to some of the questions about why some civilizations developed extensive writing systems and some just didn't. I don't have a good guess on that, but that's a really interesting point. Could it be the geography? If you're in a very rugged area, it doesn't make sense to try to make a wheel to roll things. Possession of the horse. You think about, we're talking about Asia, the Mongols, the Huns, the various tribes out there that became a horseback society, and they packed light and had portable tents and things like that. And they didn't have wheels; they just had horses, but they had the horse. And so it's a very good. That's a very good question. Anything else?
I'm curious how accessible technology like LiDAR is to common
Well,
people now.
there's actually sites that you can go on the internet, and different agencies that have done LiDAR, you can actually pull it up and look at it. And but some of it, if it's really high resolution for a project like what I was talking about with the burn scar, that was one that had come in and done a very, again, it was like the assessing the fluvial hazards of what could run off of the burn scars. They concentrated just on those low-lying areas off the burn scar, so we would be able to plan and react and that sort of thing. But it was extra high resolution just because of that. But a lot of it is becoming more available that you can look up. And I don't know specifically of any. I know there are sites that you can look up that imagery. Yeah, Robert.
Didn't they use sonar to find the leaks? They used sonar. I don't know.
Oh, really? I don't know.
I thought that's what they used to find the leaks, the water leaks in Baltimore.
Yeah, I read them, yeah.
Yeah.
Because they were hoping it was all iron pipe, which gives off a very good signal, but the PVC.
Yeah.
No, right. Right. Yeah. So.
Yeah.
I thought somebody used LiDAR here or in this area or something, and I can't remember.
Well, the only one that I'm aware of was right after the fire, I think 2019. It was used to see where we could have the most impact with trying to slow down the water surges that would be coming down the basins. So, all right.
Great.
Anything else? Well, it's been very enjoyable, and thank you all for coming, and thank you all for reading the book and sharing that experience together. And I'm really looking forward to the additional presentations. So, thank you.
Tell me your name again. Robert. Robert.
Enjoyed it.
We'll be asking.
No, it's the one that was the community rebuilding. It was the city of the monkey god, and about the city that they found using LiDAR.
Bob, you gotta take all these cookies, right? You're gonna take all these cookies, right? At least a couple, right? It tastes good. Obviously got some butter in those cookies.
That's what I got from him.
Lost City of the Monkeys going.
Because I'm starting with my.
Yeah, checked out. Was checked out?
I'm gonna read it.
A little reincorporation alteration.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, that's spring, right? Technically,
She's fine with it. So,
Lost City of the
Oh yeah. I was telling her I didn't even have a chance to talk about it. Some of this. I mean, the Denver chronology, the rest of it is pretty standard. The trowels and brushes and the wooden approach when you're scraping things like pottery that you don't want to use. But this is actually a bamboo chopstick that I just trying to find.
Today, I think.
Sharpen up, so it is. Stuff like this. Who's here? We've got basically a hollow auger.
Yeah.
This through.
Because they ran out of money.
I'm sure they ran out of
It walks into
Yeah, his
this
time period
Your
ran out.
dates.
screen
Yes.
tree, and you just put your extractor
Well, you
in,
can take private.
and then you start
Sure,
in
he
the
has
tree, and you
funds to
just
take
aim.
private.
Well, here's an example, so you can see. I didn't quite hit the center of the tree,
Yeah.
but I was pretty, well, actually, that, oh, right there is probably about the center of the tree. Yeah, so,
Taking care of
but that was a fairly small bristle cone, like probably an 8-inch or something, and of course this is, I started to stand this up and read, at least quantify the readings, but I figured it's probably starting to grow in the 1850s or 60s, but this is a good example that, towards the end, it was hardly growing at all, It's able to add in a lot of mass, when they get a lot of diameter on them, and of course they don't. But look at that, look at some of that growth, but that would probably been 1870s, 1880s.
A branch
Yeah,
that grew well and it died.
Yeah, and that was another thing that we use burn marks on trees that survived fires.
Oh, those burn.
I think that is. So the ponderosa are really great because they can burn, and then they get what they call a cap face. So it burns down, burns all the bark off, and then the living tissue forms edges around it, but that's exposed. A lot of times there's charcoal there, and they took one from Panadero that was a 1636 tree that had experienced 4 fires since 1636, and we were able to verify when those happened by the cap faces, and then also I lost my train of thought. Something else about ponderosas, they're very likely to survive low intensity. Oh yeah, the other thing was that it'll tell you which direction the fire came from, because the cat face will be opposite, so the flames are blowing up against the tree here, it comes around, and then it starts to do a little vortex that goes up the trunk and then burns in, so the orientation of the tree. So
Is this tool made like long enough to get to the?
there's different sizes.
Really big
Yeah,
trees?
yeah. There are different sizes. There's ones that are even smaller than that one, but that one's pretty good for most of everything we have around here. But yeah, again, and what I typically do when I do a living tree, I'll take pine tar and just heat it up and then just poke it in the hole. So it's because pine beetles and other borers are attracted to a sick tree that's running sap, and so that just seals it up and keeps it. It's basically an open wound, and they say, "Oh, let's get him,"
So I've been here on a piece of property in the Latoya Valley for about a year, hiked every single day, and I've tried to find the most reliable method for aging trees.